Earlier this month, many news headlines around the world told the story of the discovery of new Dead Sea Scrolls. The first Dead Sea Scrolls found in about 50 years. What I'd like to do is tell you how these scrolls were found, what they contain, and more importantly, the things that aren't said in the newspaper. That is, how important are these discoveries to the field of biblical studies? So let's get started. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the 1940s and 1950s in the caves alongside the Dead Sea in Israel. Since that time, many people have gone searching caves in the area to find more ancient treasures. And for this reason, in 2017, the Israel Antiquities Authority decided to send teams to every cave in the region in order to see if there are any more scrolls and to preempt any finds that would have been found by looters. They sent a few teams, and these teams used drones and also rappelled down some very serious cliff faces into caves and did some very impressive physical maneuvers in order to find what they did. They went through 600 caves and have about 300 more caves to go. So let's take a look at what they found, what everyone is talking about. The oldest object was a 10,500-year-old basket that is very well preserved. And this, of course, is before the Israelite and biblical period. Also, a 6,000-year-old child burial was found, and this was also before the biblical period. Fast forward about 6,000 years, some Bar Kokhba period coins were also found. These come from the 1st and 2nd century of the Common Era. Now, most importantly for us, 80 fragments of parchment were found, and some of which had writing. And the largest size of these fragments were a thumbnail, so these are really small, tiny pieces, but when the fragments are put together, we can actually make out some writing. These fragments were found in the so-called Cave of Horror. The Cave of Horror was named this because in it were 40 skeletons. 40 skeletons were found, and these were presumably the Jewish people fleeing the Romans around the Bar Kokhba period. This site was visited and excavated by the famous archaeologist Yigal Yadin in the early 60s, and he also found similar Greek fragments in that cave. Now, these people brought an ancient scroll from the 1st century before the Common Era into the cave, and the fragments that were announced last month belong to this scroll. The scroll is the important Greek Minor Prophets scroll, and like many Dead Sea Scrolls, it has a number of names. If you're going to search for it, it's known as 8 Chev 1, which means it's from the 8th cave at Nachal Chever. It's also known as 8 Chev 12 GR, which means the 8th cave at Nachal Chever, the 12 Minor Prophets in Greek, and it's sometimes even called the Greek Dodecapropheton scroll. This scroll is a translation of the book of 12 minor prophets in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and this is a translation into Greek. There are a number of things that make this text interesting. For example, even though it was written in Greek, the name of God, Yud-He, Vav-He, is written in Paleo-Hebrew script. So what was found? What do these 80 fragments say? What they tell us are a few verses from the book of Zechariah and Nahum. So let's take a look at the 8th chapter of Zechariah. The book of Zechariah is about God's promise to rebuild Jerusalem, the people of Israel, the temple, and so on and so forth at the beginning of the Second Temple period. But all this hinges on proper behavior, which brings us to verses 16 and 17. These are the things you are to do. Speak the truth to one another, render true and perfect justice in your gates, and do not contrive evil against one another, and do not love perjury, because all those are things that I hate, declares the Lord. The next passage comes from the book of Nahum, also known as Nahum in English. And this book, we don't know much about it, but we do know that God is angry at the Assyrians and he is going to punish them. And we have a description of how mighty God is. In the 1st chapter we read, "The mountains quake because of him, and the hills melt. The earth heaves before him, the world and all that dwell therein. Who can stand before his wrath? Who can resist his fury? His anger pours out like fire, and rocks are shattered because of him." So I've told you what was found, I've told you how it was found. Now let's talk about the relative importance and the impact on scholarship that these finds will actually have. So I'm going to go with a nuanced approach here, and at the beginning I'd like to say these are very important finds. For about 50 years we all wondered, are there any more Dead Sea Scrolls? And the answer seems to be yes. We actually found some more. And even though it's not in a new cave, at least we know that some of the old caves might actually have some more scrolls hidden underneath the dirt. So this is really interesting. The idea of potentially new scrolls is fascinating and tantalizing. Next, even though the scrolls haven't been published yet, when they will be published, I expect about 1 or 2 articles at least, we will probably find some new readings about these verses. Most ancient texts have minor differences, whether it's one letter in spelling or in meaning or even a verse. There are minor differences whenever you look at 2 texts. So I imagine that these 4 verses in total will have footnotes in them in scholarly Bibles relating to these texts. So they are important, and I look forward to reading the articles. And so now I'd like to tell you what the newspapers don't tell you. And that's, while these finds are fascinating, they are not really monumental. Let me explain. I think one of the articles that I was reading mentioned that there are 15,000 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more. Many of those fragments are much larger than our fragments and have whole paragraphs of text. And so out of the 15,000 that we already had, we have now 80 more, some that might have some text. So it's not a lot. I did a quick search on accordance, and we know of about 8,000 verses in the Tanakh Hebrew Bible that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so here we have 4 more. When you have 8,000, 4 more isn't going to make much of a difference. Also, these fragments are Greek. And what that means is that we're not dealing with an ancient Hebrew text, we're dealing with a translation of an ancient Hebrew text. And in many ways, this text is going to tell us more about the Greek-speaking Jews of the Second Temple period than about the books of Zechariah and Nahum itself. So that if there are minor differences from the biblical text that we know of, it might actually just be because it's a Greek-speaking audience and there were special needs there. So all in all, this was a really fantastic find. I'm really excited to see it all over the news, but with a grain of salt, it's not going to make major changes in the way we understand the Hebrew Bible or even the biblical texts of Nahum and Zechariah. If you enjoy the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and would like to study it in Hebrew, please consider taking my summer course at the Institute of Biblical Culture, where we'll be studying a year's worth of biblical Hebrew in a summer. Or if that doesn't work out for you, you can reach out to me about tutoring you yourself or even a small study group. Thanks for watching.